Welcome to Almost Impossible. Our first episode is about the Manhattan Project, the secret weapons program that built the atomic bomb. It's a story of astounding amounts of resources and brainpower being put to work to create something the world had never seen in just 27 months. But it's also a story of unprecedented tragedy. The bombs created would kill between 129 and 226,000 Japanese, many of them civilians. So this is obviously a morally complex story about people caught up in global war, and we'll get into those debates later in the episode. But for now, here's something to consider about the scale of the Manhattan Project. So Oak Ridge, the Manhattan Project's uranium enrichment facility, would use 1/7 of the US's total power from 1943 to 1945. And that was just one site of many within the Manhattan Project. For this episode, we're going to focus on Los Alamos and the people that worked there. In particular, someone you may have heard of but might not know that much about, Robert Oppenheimer. The goal of this show is to figure out how Oppenheimer and the people that worked on the Manhattan Project accomplished so much in such a short period of time. That's why the show is called Almost Impossible. We're trying to figure out how groundbreaking projects happened and draw out lessons so we can accomplish more ambitious projects today. Also, hello. I'm Craig Cannon, one of the hosts of the show. I'll be joined by my co-host, Tim Hwang, in just a second. But two quick things before we get started. I want to quote Dan Carlin and say we are not historians. We're just interested in these stories and want to share them with you. And two, we want to thank our sponsor, Protocol Labs. Protocol Labs is an open source research, development, and deployment lab. Their projects include IPFS, libp2p, Filecoin, and many more. Their aim is to make human existence orders of magnitude better through technology. Protocol Labs is a fully distributed company. Their team of more than 100 members works remotely on advances in computing and related fields. If you're interested in working at Protocol Labs, visit protocol.ai/join.
We're going to open the series with the Manhattan Project, the secret weapons program that built the atomic bomb during World War II. Now, on some level, this is an obvious choice. It's a classic example of a technological development effort that fundamentally changed the course of the 20th century. But on a deeper level, we think it's a useful starting place because it can help us answer some bigger questions about how ambitious technological leaps happen. First, how and why does a society marshal resources for science? The Manhattan Project was an enormous commitment of human, financial, and material resources during wartime. How does that come to be? What are the resources that need to be in place for that kind of mega project to even come about? Secondly, how can a massive project achieve speed? From the period of time of the opening of Los Alamos, the core laboratory of the Manhattan Project, to the testing of the first atomic bomb, the Trinity test, that was only a period of about 27 months. That was a wildly short period of time. So what allows a project of this kind of scale to succeed and succeed quickly? And then finally, how do scientists and engineers keep or lose control of the things they create? Scientists might have created the bomb, but ultimately it was governments and the military that came to control the bomb. How does that happen? And who determines who wins in that battle for control?
But before we get to all that, Tim, it's important to understand what was actually going on in physics to make something like the Manhattan Project possible at this time.
Yeah, so let's set up what's going on in the world of physics. The early 1900s were a really exciting time in the field. We were understanding the nature of matter better than we had ever done so before. And in the 1920s, Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg built the theory of quantum physics, which essentially replaced classic physics and expanded our understanding of the atom. Essentially, we moved from an understanding where we thought about matter as a component of atomic parts to thinking about subatomic mechanics. And Einstein's theory of relativity and its famous equation E equals mc squared sort of suggested that there was an immense amount of energy stored up in the fabric of matter. And people started putting two and two together and sort of thinking about what you could do with all this. So there's a person who will become really important to the story of the Manhattan Project, Leo Szilard, who is in the 1930s kind of thinking about these developments in the field. And he sort of imagines the idea that you could use sort of nuclear fission as a way of unleashing this energy in sort of atoms. And he patents the idea of a nuclear fission reactor, right? Years and years before it became a sort of practical thing to do. He also started imagining the idea that you could unleash this energy for military purposes in the form of a bomb. But these are still largely kind of theoretical speculations. But it was pretty soon after, in 1938, that two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, actually demonstrated that you could do fission in the lab, that you could fragment up atoms in a way that unleashed energy. And this was a really big deal because what was previously kind of an abstract theory suddenly became a practical reality.
And that practical reality matters a lot because the majority of the people working on this are German. And in 1933, Hitler would have taken over as the Chancellor of Germany. And by 1939, right around the same time all of this is being published, Germany invades Poland, beginning World War II.
So these political developments create a ton of worry within the physics community. You basically have the knowledge to potentially build a really powerful weapon, and a regime that has demonstrated it's willing to, violate the sovereignty of other countries, is a fascist regime, is a totalitarian regime. And so this all kind of creates a ton of worry in the physics community. People really quickly start seeing where this is going. And the physics community tries to get a message to sort of the nation's leaders. So Leo Szilard, who really kind of in the 1930s is envisioning that this can happen, teams up with Einstein to write a letter to FDR, who was president at the time. And that happens in August 1939. And it warns FDR about the sort of reality of fission, the potential for atomic bombs, and also suggests the possibility that Germans may already be working on it.
That sounds great, right? Einstein, everyone's heard of Einstein. Send the letter to the president.
Yeah, love that
it reaches
Einstein
the president.
Guy.
Yeah, everyone loves Einstein. So you think something's going to happen, but it doesn't. So basically how it goes down is Leo Szilard gets the letter to FDR. FDR establishes an advisory committee on uranium, appropriates a small amount of money, just kind of like quiet. Szilard then goes to the military. He goes to the military and they're like, listen, we've heard of all these crazy weapon ideas. We've heard of death rays. Keep going. And so again, Szilard makes another stop. He tries to go and get some money. Maybe we can just do a little bit more research. And they're like, sorry, we don't have the money for this right now. So it's basically a stalemate for 2 years.
Yeah, and this is a really big thing that a lot of people don't get about the Manhattan Project. The science was there, the possibilities of turning that knowledge into an atomic bomb were there, and there was even a war going on that created an urgent need to work on a weapons program. But it actually wasn't any of those things that actually got the Manhattan Project rolling. It was basically a deadlock for 2 years.
So what actually ends up being a triggering factor for the Manhattan Project wasn't entirely the science, it was the people. And one of the most important people in this story, the hero of our story, is Robert Oppenheimer. So we're going to give you a little bit of a background on him right now. So Robert Oppenheimer, born in 1904 to a well-off family in New York City. His mother's a painter, his father's a wealthy textile importer. The main thing to know about this kid, from an early age, totally precocious. So there's a funny anecdote. He would spend time in New York City collecting rocks in Central Park. And over time, he started to categorize them, write about them, and even actually submit little essays to the New York Mineralogical Society. Eventually, they invite him to give a speech, having no idea that he's a child. And his father's like, yeah, go for it. And so he shows up, 12-year-old, standing ovation, gives the speech. Everyone's a fan of him. And it kind of just sort of indicates both the confidence and the degree to which he was sort of the precocious little wonder kid from New York City.
So how does this nerdy kid collecting rocks in Central Park go to become the administrator of the Manhattan Project? And the link there really is physics. So he becomes an undergrad at Harvard, he is a chemistry major, and he eventually does a grad degree in physics and specifically quantum physics. And that interest draws him not to the US, but ultimately to Germany, to the city of Göttingen. And this is a big deal. He arrives there in 1926. He's invited to study there by the researcher Max Born. And Oppenheimer arrives in the middle of a massive intellectual movement of young minds all working on problems in quantum physics. And it's worth kind of taking a step back to appreciate how young some of these researchers were. If you're familiar with some of the names, Paul Dirac was 24, Wolfgang Pauli was 26, Ernst Pascal Jordan was 23. Heisenberg, who was Bohr's kind of counterpart in sort of founding quantum physics, was 24 at the time of his breakthrough paper. And this really young, kind of dynamic field really accelerates Oppenheimer. It inspires him, but he also becomes massively productive as a researcher. So from 1926 to 29 in Göttingen, he publishes 16 papers. That's wild. If you've ever tried to write even one academic paper, you know this is an incredible output. In 1 year alone, he publishes 7 papers. And they all kind of dance around different issues in quantum physics. One of his most original contributions is what's known as the theory of field emission, which is really kind of modeling and understanding the emission of electrons from metals when they're in the presence of a very kind of strong field. And this creates a huge amount of kind of personal growth for Oppenheimer, and he in some ways becomes sort of a leading kind of contributor to this community, and it really sets him up for the rest of his life. And this kind of accelerates him. And in 1929, he takes a professorship, returns to the United States, and becomes a professor at Berkeley.
Okay, Tim, but it's worth backing up because Berkeley in 1929 was not the Berkeley that we're used to today. Germany was where all this stuff was happening. It's where the important work was. It was, like the Silicon Valley of physics or whatever in the 20s. But what ended up being so appealing to Oppenheimer is that he had the opportunity to essentially establish the theoretical physics program at Cal. And so he kind of started, he had this initial period in Göttingen where he was prolific, where he was publishing papers. He kind of comes into this new personality type of a synthesizer and kind of like a rapid understander, but almost kind of like ADD in his switching between problems as he joins at Cal. So, for example, he starts working on black hole theory. He gets into it. He writes a little bit about it, publishes a paper called On Continued Gravitational Contraction. But in short order, he's now working on meson theory like a year later, which at the time really wasn't what people would describe as kind of like the dogged, intensive work or the manner of working that you would need to publish something really important. But whatever the case, like that was Oppenheimer's style. And it's how he began to work, because in many ways, I think we're starting to see here just how competitive he was, because across the world, people were working on similar problems in physics, and Oppenheimer was always very excited to race to be the first. I think there's a very funny quote kind of talking about Oppenheimer at this time. So he was known as Opie or Opia among many people in the scene. And so it goes, Opie was extremely good at seeing the physics and doing the calculation on the back of the envelope and getting all the main factors. As far as finishing and doing an elegant job like Dirac would do, that wasn't Opie's style.
And, I think this is really where Oppenheimer starts to shine and show his sort of real unique brilliance, right? In Göttingen, he becomes a sort of member of a community and an intellectual contributor. He can clearly do the work. He can clearly publish the papers. But what's unique about Oppenheimer is that he's also kind of an intellectual leader. He shapes the culture of science. And so Craig talked a little bit about, in some ways his methodology was very rough and ready in a lot of ways. But we get these really fascinating anecdotes around Berkeley that really show that he has also has a talent, I think a knack for sort of constructing scientific communities of researchers. So famously around Berkeley, he was followed by a group of students that were called the Nim Nim Boys, and they sort of imitated his aesthetics and style, right? So Oppenheimer smoked Chesterfields, so the students smoked Chesterfields. He didn't like Tchaikovsky, so the students didn't like Tchaikovsky. And I think this is a really important thing because it becomes one of Oppenheimer's talents as he becomes an administrator of the Manhattan Project, because it turns out that it's not just about getting the science right, it becomes a great deal about getting the culture right as well.
And so also while Oppenheimer is at Berkeley, he meets one of his first early important collaborators, an experimental physicist by the name of Ernest Lawrence. So Lawrence is from South Dakota. He went on to work at Cal, spent his time riding horseback in the hills of Berkeley, which is kind of hilarious to think about today. And important to our story is that Lawrence is the creator of the cyclotron. And so cyclotrons are essentially a device to separate isotopes of an element. So in an element, you have kind of a mix of different isotopes. Isotopes vary by the number of neutrons they have. And so what the cyclotron does, it allows you to separate the isotopes, which, stay tuned, will be important to our story.
So let's back up a second. We've been talking about Oppenheimer for a little while. We've been talking about Berkeley and what's been happening in the world of physics, but we need to remember what's happening in the world at large around the atomic bomb. When we sort of last left the story, Leo Szilard was out there trying to warn everybody that this is a possibility and that the Germans might be able to work on it, but had largely hit a dead end. So Szilard with Einstein wrote a letter to FDR, didn't care, set up a committee, but not much happened. He tried to pitch it to the military, who didn't have a whole lot of interest in investing in this kind of speculative work or even investing the amount of money that would be necessary to try it out. And it really wasn't until 1941 that a small network of people started swinging the pendulum of history in the direction of the bomb. And because things are deadlocked in the US, the first initial progress actually happens in the UK. So there's a group called the Maud Committee that produces a thing called the Maud Report, which sort of suggests that the atomic bomb really might be a practical, feasible thing that could be worked on and developed. And this report is important because it changes the mind of a guy named Vannevar Bush, who is one of FDR's primary scientific advisors. So one of the big questions that confronts Vannevar Bush and a number of scientific advisors thinking about the atom bomb in the early 1940s is the question of fissile material. So the mechanics of a nuclear bomb in some ways are pretty simple to understand. It's based on the premise that fission, which is the splitting of the nucleus of an atom, releases energy. Now, one of the really interesting things that happens, and Leo Szilard was worried about this in the 1930s, is that if you have that fission happen in a sufficiently kind of unstable material, you can set off a chain reaction. And a chain reaction of fission creates the energy that really is at the core of the atom bomb. And so the big question ends up being, how much material do you need in order to get a critical mass of chain reaction to occur to release the energy for an atom bomb? And in this, isotopes become really important. So uranium, specifically an isotope of uranium called U-235, is a really good candidate for the fissile material of a nuclear bomb. But one of the big questions that no one can quite figure out in this early phase is just how much you need. And so there's a series of meetings that go on during this period of time, and Ernest Lawrence is actually involved in some of these meetings. At this point, interestingly, Oppenheimer is not involved, largely due to his left-wing commitments, right? So he was, while never a communist, he donated to various left-wing causes and seemed overall like a security risk. And so he was kind of on the outs in this early phase. But in October 1941, there's a secret meeting with a lot of the key players, including Lawrence. And Lawrence, being sort of a close friend of Oppenheimer, brings him along. And it's in this meeting that Oppenheimer is able to provide some of the key calculations that indicate the exact amount of U-235 you need for an effective weapon. And after this point, Oppenheimer's kind of on the inside. He has an insight into how the bomb should be built. And so they bring him along anyways, despite reservations about his left-wing connections. And so ultimately in May 1942, he's appointed to be sort of the S1, the kind of directorate involved in this project, to be the director of kind of research on fast neutrons. And his goal is basically to kind of continue sketching out how the bomb could be practically built.
Okay, so now Oppenheimer is in charge of fast neutron research. And so it's going to be his job to recruit a team to figure out what would it actually look like to build a weapon of this caliber. And so he'll recruit people. Many would go on to future fame. Many were already famous, like Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, Robert Serber, Enrico Fermi. And they would spend the summer kind of really detailing out what it would mean to build the bomb. Long story short, takeaways are, this is going to be an incredibly dangerous and incredibly explosive weapon. Not only that, it's going to take an incredible amount of industrial scale work to build this thing. So coming back to Lawrence, this is why the cyclotron is going to matter, because the cyclotron is going to be the most feasible way of getting enough U-235 to make a bomb. If you can't get enough, it doesn't happen. So this kind of ends the summer session once they submit effectively like a blueprint of building the bomb, and we're off to the races.
So far, a lot of what we've been talking about is nerds hanging out with one another. We got physicists meeting up at conferences, coming up with the designs for the atom bomb. But let's just not forget, this is a weapons program and it's a military program, which means that the military is going to make the calls. So I want to take the time right now to introduce the character of General Leslie Groves. If you're sitting in front of a computer, I encourage you to Google a photo of him up. The man is a tank. He's 6 feet tall, 250 pounds. He's gruff. He's straightforward. He basically was on the Army Corps of Engineers planning out the construction of the Pentagon. And he's kind of forced into working on the Manhattan Project. He, when later interviewed, would confess that he was largely interested in going to Europe and fighting in the war, and was actually, frankly, kind of disappointed to being appointed to this project. And he's responsible ultimately for determining who is going to become sort of the administrator for the Manhattan Project. And in 1942, he meets Oppenheimer to audition him for the role. Now, we should take a pause just to recognize that there's just so many ways for this not to work. Oppenheimer's kind of métier is that he works with students and scientists. That's his home territory. He is not used to working with military guys. And there's an incredible scene when they meet up for lunch to do this audition at Berkeley. And this is a real like bro meets nerd moment. Leslie Groves would later say of Oppenheimer that, quote, Oppenheimer is a genius, a real genius. Oppenheimer knows about everything. He can talk to you about everything you bring up. Well, not exactly. There's a few things he doesn't know about. He doesn't know about sports. And so this is really kind of like this like tough army guy meets sort of nerdy Berkeley lefty scientist dude. And what's surprising is coming out of that meeting, Groves decides to appoint Oppenheimer to be director. And there's a few reasons why that's the case. The first one is he wants Oppenheimer because he was ultimately an intellectual leader, but also a scientific culture leader, right? That he was kind of brought into Berkeley and helped build it into a world-class school for physics. And I think that kind of sort of community building is very attractive to Groves. The second thing is that even though Oppenheimer is a theoretical guy, he spent a lot of time hanging out with experimentalists and knows how to work with experimentalists. Groves would later say that Oppenheimer was one of the first scientists that he talked to that was really interested in talking about the practical solutions in building the bomb. And finally, Groves sort of buys Oppenheimer's pitch, which is rather than having sort of a remote group of researchers working with one another, that they should centralize everybody in a remote laboratory that's dedicated to building the bomb. And so despite some resistance, Groves stands by his man, and his appointment is affirmed. And so Oppenheimer is ultimately appointed to become director of the Manhattan Project. Now, the thing to know about Leslie Groves is that the man is a maniac. We've been building up this meeting between him and Oppenheimer in October 1942, but the guy has already been running for a month, and it's amazing to see what he's been doing. So let's just quickly peek into his itinerary the month before he meets Oppenheimer. So in September 18th, Leslie is sort of officially taking control of the project, and he's appointed to run the project. That very same day, he just goes ahead and orders 1,200 tons of high-grade uranium ore. The next day, he's ordering an acquisition of a site in Oak Ridge, which will basically be responsible for uranium processing. And in late September, he's basically crossing the country, meeting all the labs doing experimental work on uranium isotope separation. And so this guy is basically getting together a lot of the sort of material resources that they will need to pull off the bomb.
So we know what Groves is up to. Here's what Oppenheimer is doing. So Oppenheimer's chief role is to not only manage the project from a scientific standpoint, but he's also recruiting the team. Basically, like Oppenheimer's simple pitch was, hey, we're going to use this to beat the Nazis. And by and large, for most scientists, that's what got them excited. Obviously, there were all these like technical challenges of building the project, but that kind of imperative to win the war via beating the Nazis was super important and paramount to most people. But there was actually a couple other camps and a couple other recruiting or failed recruiting methods at the time. So another group of physicists were actually just more concerned that the Nazis were going to get the bomb. There were rumors, there were kind of many half-truths about the status of the nuclear project in Germany. And many people were just so concerned that like the Nazis would get it first and who knows what would happen then. And then there was a third group of people who actively did not work on the project. Although that being said, for the most part, they ended up working on World War II / military efforts at the time, radar being the number one because for many people, they thought that was going to be the tech that would win the war.
So if this were a movie, and it's going to be, this would be what I'd call kind of like the Ocean's 11 moment, right? Groves has obtained the uranium, the resources, he's bought the land, he's set up the kind of base and facilities. Oppenheimer's collected the team, the most brilliant minds, and they're all motivated to go beat the Nazis. And so, you know, this would be the moment in the movie where, you know, they get to work and things start all coming together and, you know, things get moving. And in 1943, the headquarters does open up. Los Alamos, the sort of central lab for the Manhattan Project, does in fact open up. But it's almost immediately a complete mess. By sort of March 1943, it's clear that something is deeply wrong. There's no schedule, no planning, no line of responsibility through the project. Oppenheimer, who's the administrator, basically has to learn on the job how to organize hundreds, if not thousands of people. And there's these big problems happening with army culture, where the army is attempting to impose its structure on a group of scientists, and those scientists are pushing back. And, I think the other thing to kind of note here is that the entire kind of nature of scientific work is flipped. It kind of is through the looking glass in the context of the Manhattan Project. American Prometheus, which is this book that we relied on for portions of this episode, noted the fact that scientists that were accustomed to working with limited resources and virtually no deadlines basically adjusted in the Manhattan Project to a world with unlimited resources and super exacting deadlines. And so the result is that in the early months of the Manhattan Project, it looks like the whole thing is going sideways. So a big part of this is that Oppenheimer massively underestimates the scale of what they're trying to do. You remember that lunch they had in Berkeley that we talked about a little bit earlier. Oppenheimer's original kind of back-of-the-envelope estimates was that they were going to pull off the Manhattan Project with about $300,000 and about 6 scientists. Now, this is just not the case. Los Alamos and the entire Manhattan Project operation ends up spending about $7 million in the first year alone. And Los Alamos as a facility really becomes a fully functional little town during the course of the project. There's servants for housework, school for children, there's laundry, there's a hospital, there's garbage collection, there's a grocery store, there's just infrastructure. And ultimately, by the summer of 1945, right, this is a project, a facility that involves 4,000 civilians and 2,000 men in uniform. And this is one of the reasons why the project is sort of on the ropes once it gets started. And it's worth noting that this was not unexpected. Even Ernst Lawrence, right, Oppenheimer's close friend and collaborator, was frankly surprised by the appointment of Oppenheimer as an administrator to the Manhattan Project, because Oppenheimer, while known as being brilliant, was kind of known as being a dilettante, an eccentric, a kind of back-of-the-envelope guy, not a meticulous administrator. And he's suddenly put in this position where that's exactly what he needs to do. And so that's a huge problem. But in the end, the Manhattan Project gets done in 3 years. So how did they get out of this mess? Well, there's kind of 3 big things that happen here that kind of are really core to getting this project to work. The first one is that Oppenheimer realizes what he's good at and what he's not good at, and he positions himself to become an intellectual leader for the project and a scientific leader for the project while delegating a lot of the other responsibilities of the project to others. So Groves, for instance, takes on a lot of the logistics of managing Los Alamos.
They also get the culture right. That's kind of how they get out of the mess. A critical component in the early days is they sort of set up a pseudo-university environment. So you have all these people from Princeton and Cal, and they're used to a certain environment, presenting on their ideas. Now, to be clear, this is something that Groves absolutely hates. He is not into. He does not want open ideas, but Oppenheimer time and again will lobby for it. Although Groves would go around and make sure no one left their work out at night, force them to put it into a safe, and then Richard Feynman often would break into those safes and leave them open. So they were trying to figure out a way to work together, because by and large, these folks hadn't culturally connected in a long, if ever. And so one funny example of this is how the military essentially wanted everyone to wear uniforms, and all the scientists were like, absolutely not. We're not doing this. And so the compromise they came to is that they just made them all officers. And so it was this silly sort of example of how these two things were kind of meet in the middle and agree that they had a larger goal and then just move forward. And so kind of all this is sort of building up to the fact that this is an incredibly unique culture. And so I think what really made all of this possible is it was a totally clean slate. So they could just start from scratch, do everything kind of almost on first principles with this clear goal, and then just move forward.
So we've been talking about the physics, we've been talking about the organization, we've been talking about the military. Let's talk for a quick moment about what they actually built.
Yeah, so, okay, we're building a bomb, right? So what does a nuclear bomb actually consist of? In very, very, very simple terms. So we're going to have a thing to blow up, and we're going to have a way to blow it up. So let's talk about the thing to blow up first. So the thing we're going to blow up is the uranium core of the bomb. So this is when Leslie Groves started, buys 1,200 tons of uranium, builds a facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You can kind of think of it as just many large cyclotrons, right? Like this is going to be used to separate the isotopes and get U-235, which importantly is a very small amount of uranium. Natural uranium is 99.3% U-238 and 0.7% U-235. So out of those 1,200 tons of uranium, we're going to end up with something the size of a basketball for the first bomb. It's going to be about like 110 pounds. And so that's the thing that we're going to blow up. And so, Tim, you can talk about how we do it.
It's important to recognize that uranium enrichment was already an incredibly difficult task. Oak Ridge is an enormous facility. It's 56,000 acres of land, ultimately employs tens of thousands of people to get to that 110 pounds of uranium at the end. And it's about to get a lot harder. As Craig was saying, right, it's a bomb, so there's two parts to it, right? You need the thing you're going to blow up and a way to blow it up. And the Manhattan Project ultimately lands on these two different designs for doing this. One of them is known as sort of the gun design. This is basically a model whereby a small amount of uranium is fired into a uranium core, and that triggers the chain reaction. A second method, which is the implosion method, turns out to be better for a plutonium version of the bomb, is basically a version where you put explosives around the core and explode it simultaneously, and that causes essentially this implosion, which creates ultimately the chain reaction for the explosion of the atom bomb. Now, at the point at which they actually test this, there's serious doubts that either of these methods are going to work. So the gun method turns out to not necessarily create a strong enough chain reaction to get to a critical explosion of the atom bomb. The implosion method also has a lot of trouble because in order to get it right, you need to explode all the charges around the core simultaneously to have an even implosion. If you don't, the chain reaction doesn't take off the way that you need. And getting that to work in an era without computers is incredibly, incredibly challenging.
Okay, so we have the implosion design, we have the gun design, we have uranium, we have plutonium. We're now at a point where we know it's possible. And a lot of the physicists are now pushing into this area of maximizing the efficiency, the payload of the bomb. They're trying to maximize how reliable it might be. And that's their kind of primary concern. But I think now what's important to recognize is this project is still managed by Leslie Groves, and Leslie Groves wants to ship.
Right. So on July 16th, 1945, the date is sort of set for the first full-on test of the atom bomb, a test that's going to come to be known as the Trinity test. And this is a big deal. So in addition to all of the scientists involved in Los Alamos, people are flying in to observe this. So Vannevar Bush, who we've not talked about for a while, FDR's key scientific advisor, is going to be there. James Conant, who's president of Harvard at the time and is involved in a lot of policy discussions around the bomb, will be there. The top brass, effectively, is there as an audience for the test of this weapon that they've created. And in the run-up, things start to go wrong. So 48 hours before, there's evidence that there's problems with the implosion explosives that are going to set off this chain reaction for the Trinity test. And Oppenheimer's emotional, and there's really concerns that this thing might not actually happen. At the time, he's sleeping only 4 hours a night. He's really kind of stressed out. It gets worse. So 24 hours before, thunderclouds start to move into the Trinity test site. The winds pick up. There's a violent storm brewing. It's unclear whether or not the weather is going to cooperate to make this test happen. And oh, by the way, outside of all this, there's still the slight concern that this test is literally going to be the last thing that humanity does. So in the build-up to the test, in the last few hours before the test, Enrico Fermi's out there taking bets with a bunch of scientists as to whether or not the Trinity test is going to literally ignite the atmosphere, which was a very real concern. And so finally we arrive at the hour of the test on July 16th, 1945.
It's 2:30 a.m., July 16th, 1945. 30-mile-an-hour winds, severe thunder showers at the test site. Oppenheimer and Groves are standing outside, pacing, looking at the sky. Half an hour later, they go inside, they talk to the meteorologists, they think it might break. Oppenheimer and Groves don't want to wait any longer, so they schedule the shot, 5:30 a.m. At 4 o'clock, the skies begin to clear. At 5:10, Sam Allison, physicist, announces 0 minus 20 minutes. We have accounts from many people that day who were there. Robert Serber, 20 miles out, lying face down on the ground, holding a piece of welder's glass up to his eyes. He's lying. He's waiting. He's waiting. His arm gets tired. He puts the glass down. Boom. The violet light blinds him. He feels a wave of heat on his face. 30 seconds later, his vision comes back, and there's a 20,000-foot column in the sky. Then a wave of thunder hits him. Frank Oppenheimer was also there. This is Robert's brother. He says, "The light of the first flash penetrated and came up from the ground through one's eyelids." Robert Oppenheimer, interviewed in 1965, said this.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Okay, so you remember that World War II thing, that fighting the Nazis thing? It turns out it's over. It's all over. So by the time the Trinity test happens in July 1945, Germany has actually already surrendered. It surrenders in May 1945. Hitler commits suicide earlier than that, in April. And ultimately, this means that the Los Alamos test goes off. But the core reason that a lot of scientists got involved in the project is now completely over. The president has also changed. So FDR, who initiated the early stages of the Manhattan Project, passes away in April 1945, and Harry Truman is now president. And as president, Truman is trying to bring an end to this war as quickly as possible. And the wild thing about all of this is that by May 1945, Japan is on the ropes. The diplomats are actually attempting to negotiate a surrender on the part of Japan, with the sticking point basically being that the United States wants unconditional surrender, the terms that were sort of imposed on Germany, while Japan still wants to retain some kind of conditional surrender. And so Truman is looking for a way out and a way to kind of push the Japanese into an unconditional surrender situation. And in this, he's supported by the military establishment that now knows that they have access to a working weapon of unprecedented power. So the military establishment begins lobbying quite hard to use the atomic bomb on Japan. One of the key meetings that occurs happens in late May 1945, and it's a meeting led by Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and James Conant, the president of Harvard, who is also involved in a lot of the kind of military scientific decision-making of the time. And what comes out of a lot of these meetings is their push to use the atomic bomb both on industrial facilities, but also on civilian targets as well. And what comes out of a lot of these meetings is that in some ways the scientists kind of fade into the background. Oppenheimer's here in the meeting, but he's not really setting the agenda. Now, this may be in part because Oppenheimer's position is a little equivocal. By this point, he's adopted sort of the rationale of Niels Bohr, which essentially is a position that the use of the nuclear bomb in military applications is justified because it's such a powerful weapon, it might bring an end to all wars entirely. And, underlying this is also a conviction that there's no demonstration of the bomb, not actually for warfare, for killing civilians, that will bring an end to the war. It's worth knowing that not all the physicists and the scientific community is on board with Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr's position on this. Szilard, who foresaw the possibility of a bomb all the way back in the 1930s, is actually very much against the use of this thing that they now know is possible. He puts together a report in 1945 that argues against the use of the bomb. He eventually petitions the president directly to advise him against using the bomb. And one of the most interesting parts about his petition is that it includes a survey of the scientists that were involved in the project. And it actually turns out that 72% of the scientists favored a demonstration over military use. That is to say, to show Japan that America had access to this capability without directly jumping to its deployment on civilian targets. And it is worth knowing that there's actually physicists on the more hawkish side, even when compared to Niels Bohr and Oppenheimer. So Edward Teller here has a very interesting set of exchanges that happens during this period with Szilard, where he actually argues that scientists shouldn't have any role to play at all in decision-making around the bomb. And that's important for what happens with Teller after the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So one of the things that comes out of these fateful days in the middle of 1945 is that the scientific community is divided. They're divided on whether or not, the bomb should be used for military purposes or only on a demonstration basis. There's a debate over whether or not scientists should be involved at all in decisions around the use of the bomb. And the end result is that the military and political establishment moves forwards. Truman's looking for a way out of the war. The military establishment wants to basically use this capability that the Manhattan Project has unlocked. And so the decision is made ultimately to go directly to military use on the Japanese. So on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima is bombed with the very first atomic weapon. And then 3 days later, on August 9th, the Nagasaki bombing occurs. So let me just recognize that we won't be able to do these events justice. They've been covered in much more depth and frankly much better elsewhere. But I think it is worth pausing for a moment to reflect on the numbers from these bombings as a way of understanding the sheer scale of the damage and human pain caused by these events. So the Hiroshima bombing immediately killed 80,000 civilians, with another 60,000 being killed in the subsequent fallout. With Nagasaki, 40,000 were immediately killed, with another 34,000 killed in the subsequent fallout. And both areas were covered in sort of radioactivity for decades afterwards. So this marks the end of World War II, and in some ways it marks also the end of scientific influence over the technology. Oppenheimer had grand plans to place these weapons under international control. This effectively never happens. And from here on forwards, the military really kind of goes its own way with these weapons. And the division in the scientific community actually allows the military to pick and choose who to work with. So many of the scientists that sort of resisted the use of the bomb are sidelined, and they decide to work with sort of the most hawkish scientists in the community. So Edward Teller, who argued for both the construction of more destructive bombs in the form of the hydrogen bomb, and also argued for the limitation of scientific influence of the bomb, comes to lead the H-bomb project and becomes the key scientist going forwards. So we're going to end the story here. There's obviously a lot more history that follows up until the present day, but I think we now have enough to take a step back and talk about what we learned.
Maybe the thing that we should talk about first are the ethical questions around building and then using atomic weapons. We let out the episode with this question of how do scientists and engineers keep or lose control of the things they create? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the two questions are really tied together, right? Because I think if you put yourself in the position of an Oppenheimer or even kind of like a researcher on the Manhattan Project, there's really two questions, right? The first one is what you should do, right? What do you think the bomb should be used for? But I think the second deeper question is like, can you do anything about it, right? About your views. You've got the character of Leo Szilard here, who, perceived that this technology or this science could be used to build a bomb way early on in the 30s. And he is just attempting from the point at which the project gets rolling to be like, slow your roll, guys, right? And he's ultimately unable to achieve it, right? And I think there's almost kind of one view that comes out of this, and I think is an important thing to think about for mega projects, is basically that the kinds of institutions that you need to get on board to make these massive leaps in scientific progress may also be the ones that limit your control over what you can do with it once you actually have built it. So what I mean a little bit here is like the Manhattan Project could not have happened without the support of the government and the support of the military. But it's the involvement of those groups that prevent scientists, whether or not they have good ethical views on this or bad ethical views on it, from influencing the ultimate outcome, right? That by the end of the story, by mid-1945, you have all these scientists kind of arguing amongst themselves, but they're kind of in the background. Like it's the political leaders and the military leaders that say, yeah, we're going to use this on Japan.
Right. And interestingly, if you go through the book, American Prometheus, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sort of a foregone conclusion. They were debating what they were doing before the war was even over with these weapons. And so I think when we look at Szilard, I think he's kind of a little bit naive, right? Like, I think he thought that maybe he could both build it and then decide how it would be used. Mm-hmm. And in reality, with a lot of these projects, it's like not how it goes.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think we actually can, point the figure actually a little bit at Oppenheimer here, right? Because I think he is naive in a slightly different way than Szilard, right? That like Oppenheimer buys the Bohr argument, right? Which is basically that no demonstration of the bomb is ever going to end the war. So you have to use it for military use, which is an euphemism for using it on civilians. Yeah. To potentially end all wars. There's a vision that like the thing that we built is so powerful that everybody will come to their senses and stop war, right? I think strikes me as deeply naive. Yeah. And I think like we can point the finger at Oppenheimer in the sense that like, I think he both should have known better. And also I think he does have the ability to influence potentially the outcome here. Yeah. My faith in Oppenheimer's ability to shape how this story turns out is really based on two things that come out of like the historical record. Like one of them is the superpower, right? That like his superpower is that he's able to influence scientific cultures, right? That he's, able to influence his students at Berkeley. He's able to put together this community of researchers that's very effective during the Manhattan Project. I think that power also gives him the leverage to influence how the physics community responds to the decision to use the bomb. But what we see is kind of a weird passiveness on the part of Oppenheimer. He kind of lets the various factions fragment. And there's this interesting moment where Szilard writes directly to Truman saying 70% of the scientists don't want you to use the bomb in this way. And Oppenheimer's kind of pissed, right? Because for him, it ends up being this kind of ego thing about who is the top scientist here. Whereas, I think what's being lost is ultimately that he also had the ability, if he had wanted to like shape the outcome.
So to kind of foreshadow what would happen in the trial, Oppenheimer is kind of criticized for sort of like stymieing the development of the bomb and the using of the bomb. So he's like damned if he does and damned if he doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, we do have to put this all on the cast of like what happens in the decades afterwards. And like one of them is basically that like Oppenheimer's left-wing, kind of commitments end up really kind of like, like putting him on ice, right, for getting involved in any of these projects going forward.
To call back to one of the early questions we asked in the beginning of the episode, how and why does a society marshal resources for science?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me is that I know, like, having read a little bit about the Manhattan Project in the past, my model before we had done the episode was basically the kind of like historical inevitability of the Manhattan Project, right? That like no matter what was going to go down, America was going to build the bomb, right? Like one way or another. Yeah. And one thing I hadn't quite realized is that there's a moment where like all of the pieces appear to be in place, right? Like the science is there. Lawrence has a cyclotron. We know how to build it. There's a war on. We need to win the war. And then it just kind of deadlocks in the United States for 2 years, right? And, I guess what I'm left with is the only reason I can come up with about why we went from a bunch of potential to an actual project was that there were these very tight informal ties between sort of the scientific community and like key decision makers in the government and the military. And it's like those social ties that actually make that happen, right? Like that, the Maud Committee convinces Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush is like leaning on Lawrence because he knows how to do some of this stuff. And then ultimately Oppenheimer gets brought in. These are just a couple of relationships here and there that I think history could have turned out really different, because what we were thinking about prior to the Manhattan Project was this is really expensive, it's really speculative, and we could be spending our money on all these other things that are probably more immediately helpful to the war effort. Right. And so like we have to answer the question, why the Manhattan Project? And I think the answer that we come up with is basically these like, delicate and infrequent but really incredibly important ties, right, between science and these kind of institutions.
Totally. Because, I mean, we sort of mentioned it in the episode, but there were other projects. There were other ideas that could have been funded. Like there was a very real effort to build radar, and which was built, to be clear. And like, it did have an impact in the war. But like the specific relationships between Oppenheimer, Lawrence, Vannevar Bush, like all of these people, that's kind of how this thing happened.
Yeah, and I think one theory you can bring, right, because ultimately I think our podcast is focused on the present, right? Like, why do mega projects happen or not happen? Why don't, major leaps in technological innovation happen or not happen? And I think I do worry a little bit about like the fact that we don't have these informal ties as much, or in the very least, you meet more technologists nowadays who are like, yeah, I'm not going to mess with any of that government stuff, right? Military or otherwise, I'm just not going to touch that government stuff. Is maybe one reason why we don't see these types of projects, right? That like there are things that certainly VC funding can achieve, but I still happen to be a believer that for some of these projects that we're talking about, it really requires the involvement of an institution like the government or even the military.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately, I think, numerically a massive lift. Like the order of funding that is involved in the Manhattan Project is billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. Like very few startups ever scratch that.
Yeah, at that point, your board would like tell you to shut down if you were just VC funded.
Oh, 100%. Like, because what outcome could possibly pay that back, right? And so you just like, there's this huge technology translation. There's like the industrialization. There's the productization of the bomb, right? So they take it like not from total scratch, but they take it from like very early all the way up to, shipping. And by and large, like that happens from government funding.
Yeah, and I think the first question that we asked and the second question we asked are kind of like interestingly in tension with one another, right? Which is basically like, what's one reason that these mega projects don't happen? Well, maybe one reason is because technologists by and large have kind of severed themselves off from the government, right? I think like, the optimist here would basically say, well, maybe that's a good thing because, what happens when those connections occur? You get shit like the Manhattan Project, right? Like basically that like scientists help to build something incredibly powerful and it's used to kill massive numbers of civilians.
Totally.
Right. And so I think that like that is one of the really interesting tensions with what we learn, I think, from the Manhattan Project is like, on one hand, we're excited about the achievement. On the other hand, the things that need to happen and the relationships that need to exist for those types of projects to happen also seem to tend to lead us down some pretty dark corridors.
Right. Because you think about like the incentives, and more often than not, government has a high incentive to win wars, especially when the people in the government are excited about wars.
Yeah, and I think like as a president or certainly as like the Secretary of Defense, your incentives are not to just fund speculative scientific research.
Right.
And so they have an angle on this funding. And I think that angle frequently is things like national security, right?
Yeah.
Like it's an incentive that is so strong as to justify these types of investments.
Right.
And so, I think we can have this really kind of interesting debate, and I don't know where I fall on it necessarily, but it's like, is it possible to get this kind of government support without those types of risks?
Right.
If you are a scientist or a technologist that has come up with something that is, as potentially world changing as like nuclear fission.
Yeah. Cause I think there's like, sort of the meta point on why we were talking about doing this show in general. It's what does it take to get inspired to dream a little bit bigger? And it's not necessarily like with or without the government. And it's not necessarily just about building weapons, but I think on the VC, kind of like smaller scale project, you're just you're individually incentivized to give a return to your investors. Like they have LPs, they have responsibilities. And I think you're just inclined to like aim your sights a little bit lower. It's like, it's not, I don't know, it's no one's fault.
Right.
It's just like how would you play the game, right? Like if you're given so many cards, like you have to play the game. And you're like, oh, this is how I'd win that little game.
Right. And I think like the scientists here are not necessarily fully high-minded themselves either, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like they got into the Manhattan Project being like, man, I just love nuclear fission. I'm sure maybe some of them did, right? But what comes out of the historical record is a lot of them wanted to beat the Nazis, right? And like that's also a very pragmatic dream, which is like, we got to win this war. I want to prevent fascism from taking over the world.
Yeah.
I think where the kind of really sticky ethical questions happen is basically where the world starts to change around the project, right? That you like got on board as a brilliant scientist because you want to beat the Nazis, only to discover that by the time the bomb is ready, like the war is essentially over, right?
Totally.
And I think, ironically, I think that's also the point at which the scientists have the least leverage, right? Because the knowledge is out there and you've demonstrated that it works. someone else is going to pick it up and use it now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple little anecdotes in American Prometheus about this, where essentially there's like, I think it's like late 43. It kind of comes to pass that the Germans don't have much. So that, because like the Germans having nukes was the backup logic. It was like, okay, 1, beat the Nazis. 2, well, if the Nazis like get something, like we also need to have something, because who knows what's going to happen.
Right.
And when both of those start falling apart, in particular when the second one starts falling apart, very few people leave the project. They're just like, well, I'm going to finish this thing. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think that's why in some ways I end up at the end of the story a little bit of an Oppenheimer cynic, right?
Yeah.
Which is that I think like he's either naive or in his actions he shows that he's not really concerned about the ethics of the project, right? He's naive in the sense that he kind of buys the Bohr argument, right? Which is like, just demonstrate the bomb, right?
And then be open with it.
Yeah, and be open with it, right? And like we can live in a world where the international community has mutual control over these weapons.
Yeah.
Right? Which is like kind of a wild thing to think, right?
Yeah.
And it's maybe no one's surprised that afterwards that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? That's one view, which is maybe he's kind of like duped, right? But I think I take the other view, which is that like there is a part of him which is that the achievement alone is something that excites him, which I think it deeply excites a lot of people who are in technology or science, which is like the reason they're in it is because the technology or science.
Yeah.
I think the worry here is about like the kind of influence of, the institutions that make these projects possible.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's like, it's a funny debate because, Oppenheimer was instrumental in building this technology, which would then be used for very positive, like nuclear power, like used for good things. And so I think about, well, could we have put in someone else, like someone with a different moral compass who also would have made this happen?
Yeah, and I think the counterfactual is interesting to consider. And I think part of the problem is how much you consider Oppenheimer as like uniquely critical to the success of the project.
Yeah.
I think he is uniquely brilliant in a lot of ways that make that are a good explainer for why the Manhattan Project is as successful as it is.
Yeah.
But the other view is also like, if it wasn't Oppenheimer, there are other scientists that the military would be more than happy to work with, guys like Ed Teller, who do end up working with the military to build a bomb that's 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb.
Yeah.
And like that, guys like him would have been there to take Oppenheimer's place.
Yeah.
And so his level of control is actually limited in this story. But I'm not so sure, right? Again, I like to return to the question, right? Which is, how do these mega projects happen? They happen because of these informal ties.
Totally.
And so I think the influence of personality on the result is a big deal, is a really big deal here in a way that like, I'm not necessarily trying to say like great men make history, but in these types of cases, it seems like it's so delicately poised on the mix of people who happen to be in a room at a particular point in time that you really can envision that like, this is why mega projects happen. And like, we want the right people in that room.
In particular, like in a short deadline.
Yeah,
I think that,
sure.
Because I think like if we were just to say like, okay, we didn't ship the Manhattan Project, like we didn't complete it in the span of World War II, it's going to happen in the next 10 years, like in the late 40s, early 50s, like as we see in Russia and many other
pretty
countries.
quickly. I mean, the Russians get the bomb afterwards, right? It's like,
Exactly.
And this is kind of like how inevitable is some of this stuff.
Exactly.
But I don't know. I mean, you talk about the Trinity tests, there's a lot of ways that Trinity test could have gone wrong, right? Like the weather could have been terrible. The firing mechanism couldn't have worked. And there is another part to the story, which is, okay, we're almost at the end of World War II, but the Trinity test goes so poorly that Oppenheimer and Groves look like total buffoons, right? Like the military has no trust in the project, and the war ultimately concludes an armistice with Japan, right? Like there may be a few months out from that happening, unconditional surrender.
Yeah.
Do Hiroshima and Nagasaki happen then? Maybe not, right? And then we're suddenly in a totally different history, right? And so like you have to answer the question of like, does the weather pattern over New Mexico in July 1945 influence this outcome?
Yeah.
And I don't know. There is a lot of chance here in the story, at least in my mind.
So Groves, right, wanted to drop the bomb without testing it, and Oppenheimer wanted to test it. I think they were so gung-ho on dropping the bomb that probably what happens is like, if all the timelines were the same but the weather threw it off, they just drop it like cold.
Right. It would just happen.
I think that's what happens. But it's super interesting if you punt like a couple months. And then, I don't know. How does the Cold War kick off? I don't know, it's entirely different. It's a different history.
Yeah, right. And again, this is kind of like this importance of these like relationships and ties to the story, right? So the final one of the set of questions that we open the episode with is, how do mega projects move quickly? And I don't know, do you think we've got any more lessons on that?
So we sort of enumerated these in the episode, but to kind of like put a finer point on it is like, we have this unique combination of Oppenheimer and Groves, right? When they both place themselves in the perfect position to be most effective. Then they get the culture right. So they have this kind of like academic, scientific culture that's married with military culture, and it has tremendous urgency. It's all about shipping. They have very tight deadlines. It's very kind of like militaristic. And then the third point was the clean slate. So this was totally from scratch, middle of the desert. It worked for Oppenheimer because he had this kind of almost like a summer camp vibe. They literally bought a boys' school and then just like retrofitted it into a town. And Groves was all about it because he was like, oh, great, no phone lines, perfect, totally secret. And I think all of those things kind of work together to set this project up for, shipping in, what was it, 27 months?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things I really like about the Manhattan Project example is it's also a really interesting window into thinking about the concept of scientific leadership. Oppenheimer comes across as a guy who is obviously technically brilliant, right? But his real genius is in figuring out how to get culture right. Like, how does he kind of create a small town that has sort of an academic vibe that will motivate the researchers, but is secret enough to satisfy the military people, but is practical enough to actually get the bomb delivered, right? And you also see him with early talents of this, right? When he arrives at Berkeley, he kind of becomes the center of this cultural scene where the students like to imitate him. And it's almost like a kind of meta science skill. Like, we tend to judge a lot of scientists on their ability to make great, like, technical or scientific achievements. Like, what papers did they publish? And I think what we see here is also maybe the equal value of this kind of like meta science capability to shape the communities around science. And I think that's one of the big factors that's to account for the sort of speed of the Manhattan Project, that like by getting this culture to work right, he's able to get the whole machine as a whole to deliver.
And he becomes this sort of inspiring leader to many because it's just a very unique combination of like pedigree and charisma. To just, like, you can tell this guy's got a huge ego. Like, he just wants to build this thing, right? And so because he had spent all the time in Göttingen, and now it's like almost 20 years in the past, but he'd written all these papers. He brings in kind of the best of the best, and that becomes very attractive to these people. Like, this was the cool project, right?
Yeah,
like the place to be.
I really like that. It's like almost the idea of like scientific legend building.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh man, that guy was in Göttingen like at the core moment, right?
Yeah.
He like published some awesome papers. He like knows he's buddy with Bohr.
Yeah,
right. And like, yeah, I think obviously that ends up playing a really big factor in his ability to kind of like recruit like a world-class team. And that's almost maybe another skill that like we haven't really talked about in the episode, but I think is present here, is basically not just kind of like the ability to shape scientific cultures, but also like scientific reputation as something that allows these mega projects to work, right? That like Oppenheimer is a guy who is attractive to other scientists. And that's one of the reasons he's able to get like the brain power necessary to pull some of this stuff off on the project.
Totally. And I think we see that kind of in public and private markets today, right? You could say like, oh, well, what's the highest leverage software engineering you could do? It's like, well, probably work for the government. And they're like, oh, but like, where are the cool people? It's like, well, maybe not. Writing COBOL exactly. Or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, and it's just human characteristic. That's how we are.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. And I think those peer effects are like really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of what's interesting is that like Oppenheimer, because of his left-wing political leanings, like almost doesn't get to play the game again, right? Like in some ways he leaves the Manhattan Project with his reputation burnished ever more than before, right? Like he's like the successful co-founder that's had multiple great exits.
Yeah.
And he obviously undergoes this trial and he's kind of effectively persecuted for his left-wing leanings.
Yeah.
And it's actually Edward Teller that becomes like the kind of core technical guy on these weapons going forwards. But it is, I think this is another kind of factor which is important, I think, for understanding like why this is able to work so well, right? Because again, I think one of the facts to return to is that when the Manhattan Project started, Los Alamos opened. Total mess, right? There's like lots of reasons to believe it wouldn't have worked. And yeah, I think the fact that it did relies on a lot of these cultural factors more than it relies on sort of technical ones.
So in closing, kind of the Manhattan Project is maybe a textbook example of something that was almost impossible, if not scientifically in timeline. It was a unique time in the world. And for that reason, we found it maybe a great example for the first episode. But it's worth remembering that not all breakthroughs are billions and billions of dollars with secret government projects and all these scientists. And we can think about that as just maybe one example, but there are many examples that we're going to cover in the future. So next month, we're going to be shifting focus to a different scene, North Carolina in the opening years of the 20th century with the invention of flight.